Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10 of 1619 and the Making of America. John Monroe here. I'm going to try an experiment with this lecture. I wanted to do some filming. You've seen some of the conversations that we've had for the lecture content. We've done a little bit of the filming outside, and I wanted to do that for this lecture, but I also made some slides, and I was trying to think, I can't show the slides outside, so how is this going to work? So I'm going to start here in my office. I'm going to do some lecturing outside. We'll see how that goes, and also intersperse it with some slides. So let me show a couple of slides here in the office, and then we'll cut to some other scenes, and then we'll cut back to some slides, and it might be a total disaster, but I'm learning how to do video content, and I want to try this as an experiment. So lecturing outside, but also with clips from slides that are taken inside. Okay, so let me move us over to my screen here. So rather than share screen, I'm just going to put my camera towards the screen. And of course, we have the opening slide for today's lecture, the global dimensions that we're looking at this week. So, welcome. We're looking at the international context this week. And what I want to do is a few things. The key things in this lecture are as follows. We're going to put 1619 in a transnational context in order to give us a new way to critically evaluate the 1619 project. As we've talked about in seminars in my group, and as I'm sure you have in the other groups, there's a way that the 1619 project is really nationally focused, and that enables us to see certain things, but also we might be able to see new things if we shift the context to a transnational one, and that's what we're trying to do this week. Now, more specifically, I want us to think about two particular things that we might be able to see when we put 1619 in a transnational context. And the first is that we might be not necessarily better, but differently positioned to see how anti-Black racism that we've been focusing on throughout the module, rightly so, but we might see here how anti-Black racism is entangled with other structures of oppression. Okay, so that's the first thing that we want to consider. Secondly, looking at the themes of the 1619 project in a transnational context will allow us to see the transnational dimensions of Black resistance to racial capitalism. So we've been talking a lot this term about white supremacy and Black resistance to it. And so here we'll be able to see how the resistance that we've talked about all term can be better positioned or differently positioned in an international context. Okay, so let me give us a little bit of an outline here for what we're going to do. So first of all, we're going to look at, as you can see here, antebellum U.S. slavery and the British Empire. So this is going to be a conversation about one of the readings, actually. So we're going to begin with that. Then we're going to move to, as I said, looking at anti-Black racism and its entanglement in other structures of oppression. And the structure that we're going to look at this time is settler colonialism. So this is another form of transnational white supremacy, another form of transnational racial capitalism. And we're going to think about this in its entanglement in its relationship with anti-Black racism. Okay, so that's going to be the second section. And then third, as promised, we're going to look at the Black freedom struggle in a transnational context, which I'm calling international racial relations. Okay, so that's what we have coming up. As I said, I'm going to try to do some of this work outside, and we will see. I'm just hoping that's going to be more interesting to watch than me sitting here in my office. So we'll see how that goes. But first, we will get some words here in a bit more depth about one of this week's readings. So I will leave this here, and then the next thing you will see will be a bit more on one of this week's readings. Okay, great. Looking forward to seeing how this goes. Okay, I'll see you in another context shortly. So hi everyone, welcome to part one of week 10, 1619. This is actually the last part that I'm filming for the lecture because as we saw in week 5 and you'll see again next week, I sometimes like to have a bit of a conversation as part of what we're doing. And I was planning to do that for the article by Rosalind Narayan on the British West Indies regiments and their representation in the press, in the antebellum press in the US South. But for reasons of COVID, unfortunately, it turns out that that's not going to be possible. So this means then we'll just proceed directly. So obviously we'll talk about that in your respective seminar groups, that article and the other assigned readings. So what I'll do now then is just go on directly to part 2 of the lecture, which you'll see me in this park. I know this because I've already filmed this part. You'll see me in this park wondering if the back and forth between the slides and the lecturing part is going to work. Now I know that it kind of works, but I'm looking really forward to, in seminar, my group anyways, feedback on the whole sort of experiment of this format of a way of doing lecture. Okay, so on to the next part of the lecture, and I will see my group in class. Have a good week. Hi everyone, John Monroe again. Welcome to the next part of week 10 of the 1619 project, looking at 1619's global dimensions. So, as I said, I'm doing a bit of an experiment with this lecture. I'm walking outside. As you can see, I'm on a walk down to the city center from where I live, not far from here. And I thought I would try giving some of the lecture content rather than, to be honest, I find it hard to sit at the desk and just speak to the computer. And maybe it'll be a little bit less boring for you if I'm out in this quite nice day. Actually, it's kind of a mix of rain, and right now the sky is pretty blue. So here we are. Okay, so as I was saying before, with the one of the things that we can do when we look at the 1619 project in a global frame is to be able to see more clearly its entanglement with other structures of power. And so the key, there are several that we might be able to put forward, but the one I want to talk about here is settler colonialism. So what I'm going to do first is, so now we're going to see, this is the part we're going to see if even this experiment of mine works. We're going to jump back to my office to look at the slide, and then I'll keep going in the talk. Like I said, who knows if that's going to work. So what I want to do is start with a couple of representations of settler colonialism, move to a definition, and then say a little bit more about history from there. Okay, so let's see if we can look back at one of the slides. Okay, so if that worked, you just looked at the slide which begins this section of the lecture and featured a painting by the artist Albert Bierstadt, which is called Emigrants Crossing the Plains from 1867. And so we see in this painting, as was true of many of the landscape paintings and advertising and many other forms of kind of cultural artistic representation of the time, this idea of the kind of empty land into which the settlers sort of peacefully make their way. And you can read into it different things. If we were together in class, this was a live lecture, I would ask you what you saw in the painting, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that in class. But you know, this idea that the settlers are making their way in peaceful fashion into empty territory and bringing civilization with them. So that's one representation of this idea. It's sometimes called westward expansion, but more recently and more sort of accurate in its description is this idea of settler colonialism. So that's one representation. Let's take a look at another, in some ways parallel representation to the painting that we just looked at. Okay, so looking then at Christian Chapman's The Great Cat is a painting from 2013. Christian Chapman is an Anishinaabe artist who, look him up, his work is really fascinating, and he has quite a range of different kinds of pieces that he does, often playing with different forms of popular culture and putting them in ways into indigenous contexts of different kinds. But I hope you can see in the painting that I chose here that it's not deliberately or directly in conversation with Bierstadt, but we can certainly see another model of what the arrival of settlers brings. In this case, well, we can read different things, mechanization, but certainly environmental destruction as well of indigenous territory. So in some ways with the Chapman painting, you have a similar process of something representing the settlers coming into indigenous territory, but from the flip side. And what I really want us to think about here is something that we've said quite a bit in this module, very appropriately so, about resistance to the structures of oppression that we've been looking at. So of course, we've been looking at African American forms of resistance in many different kinds. And here I want us to think about the same principle. When we're thinking about settler colonialism, we're talking about resistance to it and the ways in which settler colonialism is shaped by indigenous resistance and indigenous sort of co-creation of the worlds that settlers inhabit. I think in particular, sometimes with settler colonialism, when it's seen as an event rather than as a structure, it seems like something that happened in the past and that's now over. And there's a way that indigenous action, agency, and participation and resistance all get written out of that picture. So let's remember Chapman's painting then as a way of not losing sight of that important point. Let's turn now to a definition. Okay, so looking at a definition then of settler colonialism, I wanted to borrow one of several definitions we could look at from Glenn Coulthard's book, Redskin White Masks. So Coulthard is Yellowknives Dene, political theorist, and in his book Redskin White Masks, which is a reference to an important book, Blackskin White Masks, by the anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon, Coulthard talks about kind of the contemporary ways in which settler colonialism and particularly capitalism are intertwined as structures of power in the Canadian context, but his work has important resonance for the situation in the US and other places as well. So I wanted to pull up a definition from this important book for us to think a bit more about this structure, settler colonialism. And I put it on my phone here so I could read it. Coulthard says, let's make sure I cross at the crosswalk here. Coulthard says, a settler colonial relationship is one characterized by a particular form of domination. That is, it is a relationship where power, in this case, interrelated, discursive, and non-discursive facets of economic, gendered, racial, and state power have been structured into a relatively secure or sedimented set of hierarchical social relations that continue to facilitate the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their land and self-determining authority. So there's a number of components in Coulthard's definition that we could focus on, and again, maybe we want to talk about these in class. We'll see. But this idea of discursive and non-discursive, so thinking about the material economic structure in which settler colonialism takes place, we'd want to maybe think for our purposes of the ways that we've thought about anti-Black racism and the history of capitalism in this class. So Coulthard thinking about that too, but also non-discursive, other ways, also discursive, other ways in which language, culture, representation, there are many different sort of dimensions to this structure. It connects to other structures also, as we see here, particularly gender, which Coulthard mentions. So we want to keep all of these in mind as itself a very complex form of social oppression that connects in significant ways to anti-Black racism in the US and elsewhere. Okay, so let's turn now to history. Okay, had to walk on a bit there because it was so loud with all the cars at the middleway. Okay, heading into the underpass of the Five Ways roundabout here. So at the next slide here, looking at the Virginia colony and the early history thereof, I wanted us to think here about how the moment of 1619 is, of course, already the scene of settler colonialism. The Jamestown colony, the colony is founded at Jamestown in 1607, so before 1619. So before the first enslaved Africans arrive, already settlers have taken up their place on the land, and are often in conflict. I mean, the initial settlers in the Virginia colony, very much like settlers many other places, very much needed the local indigenous peoples, and particularly their knowledge, just simply to survive, which was very difficult in the early years of settlement. But nonetheless, the settlers are there, and so we want to think about here that, and it's the Powhatan Confederacy. This story is often, sort of simplified and romanticized as the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. And so here we want to think, obviously, in more complicated ways, much more complicated ways than the typical Pocahontas story, or the way that it's usually narrated, as, again, the arrival, so a transnational process, obviously, the arrival of these settlers from elsewhere onto indigenous territory, encountering the Powhatan Confederacy, and coming up against warriors and leaders like Opchenan-Kano, who was one of the key figures on the indigenous side in the Powhatan Wars, as they were called, between the settlers and the indigenous peoples in the colony of Virginia. And so, what else did I have on that slide? Oh, of course, and Bacon's Rebellion, which is in 1676. It's a rebellion in the colony. Nathaniel Bacon leads a rebellion against the colonial government. And this is often seen, rightly, as a moment, often seen in the historiography, rightly, as a moment in which forms of anti-black colonial legislation and rule are come into being in the aftermath of this rebellion, because the prospect of black and white impoverished colonists taking on the authority of the British colonial system in Virginia was obviously something that the colonial powers were very concerned about. And so in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, in comes a set of kind of rules, different punishments by race, and it's often seen as a moment in which white colonists are won over to the colonial order. It's an early articulation, maybe we might say in Du Bois's words, of the wages of whiteness at work. So that's often seen as a very important moment in the racial history of the United States in what's called the colonial period. But those same rebels against colonial authority were also often one of their grievances against colonial authority was that it wasn't allowing the settlers to take as much land and to attack indigenous settlements as they otherwise might have. So again, the structures are intertwined, and the relationship between them is a complex one. So if we think again in more of a transnational context about the early colony in Virginia, if we think about 1619 and what else is happening at the same time, it draws our attention to this other structure that's interacting in complicated ways with, of course, the beginnings, the hugely, hugely important beginnings of racial slavery. Let's look at another moment and also see how we might be able to see or begin to think about these two structures interacting. Okay, so another moment that we could think about, that we talked about quite a bit in this module so far, is that of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And we might want to think here also in a much later period. There's also a way in which sometimes in the historical narrative of the United States, settler colonialism, again as event, is more acknowledged in the earlier history. but then it seems like it sort of fades into the background later on. So let's look at a much later period, 200 years later, at the Civil War and Reconstruction, and we could think about that also as a moment equally, because the structure doesn't go away, equally a moment structured in settler dominance. So here, of course, where we talked about the Civil War and the Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the overthrow, the white supremacist overthrow of Reconstruction, and then the, as Rayford Logan called it, the nadir that follows. So we can think through that same period also by thinking about indigenous settler relations. And here we might think about the Homestead Act of 1862, which encouraged settlers to move westward, so during the Civil War. So again, this is Lincoln, the same president, of course, leading the Union against the Confederacy, is also encouraging settlers to move west and to take up territory that is occupied by, or was very recently occupied by, indigenous settlements. 1862 is also the year of the Dakota War in what's now Minnesota area of the U.S., or what's currently called Minnesota. And so here, settler encroachment on Dakota territory led, as it did, in example after example, in the process of settlement, it led to violence, of course. It led to pushback. It led to fighting. And an uprising took place. The settlers were ultimately victorious. And in 1862, this also led to, among the captured prisoners in the aftermath of this conflict, of this uprising, were, I wrote it down, I want to make sure I didn't get the number wrong, 38 prisoners, Dakota prisoners, who were killed at Mankato, Minnesota, which is just basically today a suburb of Minneapolis. So this is also happening at the same time. And then after, if we extend the period a bit further, in 1887, the General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, which, so if we think about the first as kind of the direct violence of settler colonialism, here, with the Dawes Act, is more of a kind of legislative arm, if you will, of the settler project. And what the Dawes Act did was to break up indigenous territory that was collectively held, parceling it into individual units held by individual members of a given community, which then made it more readily able to be put up for sale. It also often, when the land was parceled into individual plots, there was surplus, quote unquote, territory left over, which was then also put up for cheap sale to settlers. So this was another means by which land was transferred from indigenous to settler hands. And also, just sort of just after the end of Reconstruction, was the beginning of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, as it was called, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, run by someone named Richard Pratt, who, in his words, his project was to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. And so these were boarding schools. In the Canadian context, they were called residential schools. They happened also in Australia and other settler colonial situations as well. And this was essentially the taking of indigenous children from their families, from their communities, and depriving them of basically their society from which they came, language, culture, food, dress, etc., with the idea being to incorporate them into the lowest rungs of kind of manual labor in the society. So this was another sort of educational aspect of settler colonialism at work. So here again, just like in the 1619 period, in the Civil War and Reconstruction period, we can also see this as an example. I should also add that many of those settlers in the Dakota War were of German background. So again, these settlers who had come from elsewhere, so the transnational dimension once again in play here, had come from elsewhere, in an international sort of process, arriving on the indigenous land, which led to this conflict. So again, we can see in this era, through a transnational lens, another form of white supremacist structure at work. Okay, so let's look at now say a few words about a more contemporary articulation of this connection. Okay, so what we have in that next slide then is the statue of Christopher Columbus at Boston Harbor. And Boston also, like many cities, has an important Italian-American community. This makes sometimes the Columbus statue to be sort of extra important for certain people in the town. So anyways, this has been a site, like many statues, and especially many statues recently, particularly as we've talked about, statues celebrating the Confederacy. So here we have the statue of Christopher Columbus, and in 2015, someone painted the words "Black Lives Matter" on it. So one, if you're interested in this connection, so here is obviously a kind of form of contemporary resistance and critique that links these two structures together. That the idea that Black Lives Matter would be written on a statue of Christopher Columbus, you know, is a very kind of insightful connection. That act in many ways sort of brings together the main point I want to make in this lecture, is to think about these things together. And one great reading of this moment and of this of Black Lives Matter being written on this statue, you can find in Tiffany Lethabo King's book, The Black Shoals, which is a book which also, a book that I've learned a lot from, which does a lot to connect Indigenous studies and Black studies, through also problematizing the idea of settler colonial studies, which I'm drawing on here as well. So that's kind of a long and complicated thing to explain, but it's important, and again, maybe it's one for us to take up in class and talk about at greater length, because the ways that these structures have been studied, and the way that the structures of power within academia sometimes replicate the kinds of power structures that we're looking at in history or society is another topic that we want to think about as well. But for our purposes for the moment, we can think about this as a contemporary articulation of the bringing together of these two structures, obviously in a critique of them. I should add that statue is no longer there. The slogan was written there in 2015, but the statue came down, you probably won't be too surprised to learn, in June of this year. Again, at a moment in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, there was, as you all know, how to put it, just so much appropriate attention on this issue, and so much discussion about anti-Black racism. But this also was the moment, and we want to think about this here, that the Christopher Columbus statue also came down. So again, here's what some discussion in the public arena looks like of these issues in the present. Okay, so from here, let's move on then to talk about a little bit about the other thing that I want us to be able to see with looking at anti-Black racism and the 1619 Project in an international context, and that is how we can see the Black freedom struggle itself as a transnational phenomenon. Okay, so here again, on the theme of resistance, I want to talk about the ways in which resistance to white supremacy in the U.S. was part of and very much connected to transnational forms of anti-racist resistance. So that's the other theme that I want us to consider here as well. So what I'm going to make just a few remarks about here is thinking about that in the era of the civil rights movement, which. Because civil rights was only part of what that movement was trying to achieve, there's also often that the civil rights movement is referred to as the Black freedom struggle, and I'll be using that language more here as a more sort of capacious way of talking about this form of activism against white supremacy and white supremacy's connections to so many other structures. The Black freedom movement was about in many ways a critique of capitalism, the economic relations of racism in the U.S. It also, at many moments, was a movement that looked at, particularly through black feminism, at gendered structures of power and their interconnection and imbrication in structures of racial oppression. So we'll want to think about the interconnectedness of the quote-unquote civil rights movement in many other things, and therefore think about it as kind of a larger movement, not just for civil rights, but the Black freedom struggle. So here, let's think a bit about its, and we'll just look at a couple of examples. There are so many we could draw upon, but here I just want to draw upon a couple of examples of the international dimensions of this phenomenon. Okay, so as you can see in the slide then, I put up a picture of a newspaper called Freedom. This was a newspaper that was managed by Paul Robeson, the great artist, singer, athlete. If you don't know too much about Paul Robeson, I highly recommend you look him up. So he ran this newspaper in the 1950s, and he was a nationally known, very internationally known celebrity of the World War II and post World War II era, and but his left-wing politics, as happened with numerous black radicals in the late 1940s and 1950s, sort of came up against the anti-communist McCarthyism of the post-war moment, and so Robeson, he had his passport taken away. There were many efforts to derail and destroy his career with varying degrees of success. There was kind of an earlier narrative. I mean, one of Robeson's most important biographers, Martin Duberman, in his biography of Robeson, tells this sort of tragic story of how anti-communism really sort of crushed Robeson and destroyed his career and so on. There's elements of truth to that, but more recent scholars have also really emphasized how much his influence continued actually through and beyond, very much to this day, the McCarthyite period. So Robeson is this internationalist leftist figure. He has this newspaper called Freedom. And one of the things that's most remarkable about this newspaper is its internationalist vision. It connects very much what we might call, again, the civil rights movement in a more limited way to other larger concerns about the economic structure of racism and the biggest event that was happening in terms of kind of international, we might call international racial relations, and that was decolonization internationally. So as the British, French, Dutch, and other European empires were decolonizing, as these colonial spaces were liberating themselves and becoming countries, this was happening at the same time as the main events of the sort of classic period of the civil rights movement. And so what Robeson's magazine Freedom does is in every issue connects these things, not just noticing that they're happening at the same time, but very much making the argument that Kikuyu struggles in Kenya against British colonialism were another dimension of the struggles in the United States in places like Little Rock and Montgomery and so on. So we see, looking at this paper, we can see how an internationalist vision very much informed a core element and some of the key players in the Black freedom struggle. Let's look for a minute or two at a couple of the writers also on this magazine Freedom. And they are, of course, Islanda Good Robeson and Lorraine Hansberry. So I call our attention to them, again, to remind us of the importance of Black feminism in thinking about the international dimensions of the Black freedom struggle. These two figures, Islanda Good Robeson, anthropologist, intellectual activist, journalist, she was one of the writers on the staff here, as was Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright, and also activist and intellectual. And what they brought to this, well, they brought many things to this magazine, but they brought a focus on gender. And in Hansberry's case, sometimes even, maybe not within the pages of Freedom, but more broadly, to sexuality, and thinking in intersectional ways about these things, brought the issues of, in particular, gender to an international analysis of white supremacy in the United States, and well beyond. So here's another way in which, if we think, okay, thinking about the 1619 Project with an internationalist lens allows us to see the internationalism of the Black freedom movement. It then also enables us to see how gender was a category of real historical and political analysis here through figures like Robeson and Hansberry. And also in that same tradition, the newspaper Freedom Ways, which I've also signaled there for us to consider. So Freedom, Paul Robeson's paper, shut down in the mid-50s. It was just too difficult to function in the McCarthyite context, just so hounded and harassed by the forces of reaction. But Freedom Ways begins in the early 1960s, and it has a lot of the same people and others involved in it. And Freedom Ways runs, Jack Odell is one of the key editors there, and he was also already a quite experienced activist by this time as well. So there's a number of people who are in and around Freedom or are learning from it who become central to Freedom Ways as well. And of course W.E.B. Du Bois is an important influence on both of these publications. Freedom Ways runs all the way into the mid-1980s. So it's a great example, and if students are interested in looking at the internationalist dimensions of the Black freedom struggle, and you're looking for a primary source, Freedom Ways is a really great place to begin, because it brings so many things together over its many issues, and the way that, again, you would see how it insists, as I'm trying to do in this lecture. I learned from Freedom Ways to be able to even sort of make the idea of this lecture, to insist that the transnational context is key to what we're thinking about here. And again, so this is a bit of a contrast then to the 1619 Project in the ways that it's much more focused on the nation. And so with 1619 then and its national focus, there's certain things that does. There's certain things that brings into clearer focus about dimensions within the United States. But here, I want to sort of pull back a bit, put that in an international context, and see these other things. The imbrication in other structures like settler colonialism, the internationalism of the Black freedom struggle itself. And the multiple other struggles that with an internationalist view, the Black freedom struggle connects to. So I made some notes about this just to make sure that I got them all. So because I can't see the slide, unlike you who can, whatever, rewind to look at it or pause on it or whatever, as I see if this format even works. But anyways, I made a couple of notes here to myself. So I wanted to say here, right, in this slide, about connecting multiple struggles from the age of the civil rights, what we call the civil rights movement. So from this perspective, the Cuban Revolution, Claudia Jones in this country, her anti-racist, legendary anti-racist activist, Claudia Jones, who was in the United States until 1955, but her work here is probably what she's best known for, connected to journalism, the founding of the Carnival in London, and other things. So we can see things like her work. We can see things like the publication of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, another of his significant books. I mentioned him earlier as an influence on Glenn Coulthard. So we can see none of those things happen in the United States, but with an international view, we can see the connection, or begin to talk about the connections between those things and the challenges to racial capitalism that took place in the United States as well. You know, for example, as I got on the slide there, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Arts Movement, Students for Democratic Society, the Black Panther Party, the anti-war movement, the revolutionary union movements. These are all different forms of struggle and resistance in the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s that we can see, if we look in an international way, the ways in which those are part of a larger transnational global challenge to white supremacy as a global system. As well, to bring it full circle, of course, to Indigenous activism in the era of the Civil Rights Movement as well. So the Indigenous, which was from numerous Indigenous nations, occupied the Alcatraz Island in San Francisco at the end of the 1960s and held it until from 1969 to 1971. And so we can see here resistance to colonialism within the U.S., obviously resistance to the settler colonial structure of the United States. We can see the United States through the Alcatraz occupation as itself not just an imperial power that projects power outwards, but itself constituted through colonialism within its borders. And of course we can see the connections then between that and, as I said, the international dimensions of the Black freedom struggle that are happening at the same time. Okay, and last but not least, you can see in my final slide, which is why I arrived here in front of the Birmingham Public Library, and I've been walking around here a little bit during these last slides because I wanted to end here because you can see that my last slide is exactly a picture of this. And so we can see through contemporary struggle, through the Black Lives Matter movement, and which of course preceded 2020, but it's the power of its articulation well beyond the United States, in many ways makes this place forever a bit different, even though of course that's not what's happening here today. But the fact that that protest was so powerful, and it echoes, it changes conversations, it's done things you know, in terms of the way that I see this country and see this city, and I imagine that's done that for you as well. So thinking about, once again, 1619 in a global frame reminds us of the fact that exactly where we stand here in Birmingham in this class is not well, the UK is not innocent, as some of the placards said here, and the structures that we're looking at, even though they're looked at in a much more national kind of framework within the 1619 project, very much help determine the relations of inequality, of oppression and resistance in a place like this. Okay, great. Well, let's see if I can stitch all these bits of video and slide together, and I hope that this works, and I'll see you in class. Okay, bye.